Welcome to the Institute of All Intelligent Life. My name is Allan Keislar, and today we are concluding our course on extraterrestrial spirituality. And I'm just going to summarize the course first, and then we'll look at any questions that anybody may raise now. So in this course, we started off by talking about Sumerian information coming from a group of extraterrestrials called the Anunnaki, who, according to Zecharia Sitchin, a great scholar of Sumerian and other ancient West Asian languages, said has a long orbit and comes near our solar system once every 3,600 years. So Zecharia Sitchin talks about how in a previous visits, when that planet came near the Earth, the Anunnaki had done things like artificially creating humanity by genetic manipulation, genetic engineering, and also allowing a flood to happen and preventing humanity, for the most part, from finding out, so that humanity was mostly destroyed. But of course, as the story of Noah has it in the Bible and Quran, one person at least found out, and that is described in the Sumerian texts also, and therefore humanity was saved. Then, moving on from there, we talked about how in the Sumerian culture there were many gods. Every city-state had its own local god, who was really evidently one of the Anunnaki leaders. So these extraterrestrials became worshipped as gods. And this, of course, was the situation in which Abraham was born, and in which the great sage and priest Melchizedek taught Abraham about one God. And then from that time on, especially in West Asia, the idea of one God developed. And in this course we talked about that in some detail, how especially the Hebrew prophets gradually over a period of many centuries developed and refined this understanding of one God. And finally, Jesus Christ and the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, also established the idea of one God finally. So extraterrestrials also, we discussed, have this idea that God is one, although there are different understandings of what that means amongst different extraterrestrials. And one source is the Law of One books, which are said to be an extraterrestrial teaching, which talks about God as intelligent infinity, is one word or name ascribed to God as as the original God, the original Godhead. And that idea having been firmly established, we can then move on and understand two other important concepts. Many extraterrestrial sources talk about many universes, and each universe has a creator. And those creators, or co-creators, as they are called in the Law of One books, or in the Urantia book also, these individuals who create universes are not the original God. They're not Allah. They are subordinate individuals, very, very powerful spiritual archangels, we might say, who each create one universe. So then we went on and discussed how, from the Urantia book, the idea of paradise and the spiritual universes, that God himself, Allah, resides on the Isle of Paradise, which is the geographical center of infinity, the center of all things. And there is also the spiritual universe, or rather many, many spiritual universes, each one of which has a sublime, exalted being heading it. And finally, we discussed the ideas of the oneness of God and the personality of God, and the thought adjusters, or God present in our hearts. In other words, this means that God lives personally on the Isle of Paradise at the center of all things, but also lives within our hearts in the form of a monitor, an infinite, omniscient, omnipotent being living within our hearts, who is also God, but at the same time is in some way, which it's a great mystery how to understand and explain this, is an expansion of God and is personally present with us, and through that mystery monitor or through that thought adjuster, God is present within each of us, our hearts and everywhere, as well as being personally present on Paradise. And then finally, we discussed a little about how God creates, that is how Allah, the original Godhead, expands or generates other realities and the nature of those realities. And the Law of One books talk about those first two realities in addition to Allah as love with a capital L and light with a capital L. And these are also beings who are infinite and omniscient, but are, again, this is a mystery beyond our understanding, but they are in addition to, or they are expansions of Allah, which comes as a result of the very first reality in addition to Allah, which is free will. So when God understands, this is all language of time, because we're within time, so we always think in terms of time. So using the word when is really just our understanding. There never was a time when all this spiritual reality did not exist, so it's not really a creation in terms of at one time not being created and later being created. It's all eternal. But in terms of a relationship, one is primary and the others are dependent. So that one primary reality, Allah, exists along with expansions like love with a capital L and light with a capital L. And then finally we talked about, this is all Allah looking outward, or expansions of Allah. And then we had one class on Allah looking inward, which is undoubtedly the greatest mystery of all mysteries, even greater than the mysteries of trying to understand how God is present in everyone's heart and how God generates other realities, but what is the internal life of Allah, and in which Allah himself, within himself, has a goal. And that, again, is something really beyond our understanding, but we talked about it briefly because it is an idea that is discussed by some extraterrestrials. All right, and then finally I just ended the class in the last class by recalling a discussion I had with Matthew Fox, a leading American mystic today, about the nature of God. And I talked about how Allama Iqbal had called God an individual, and I asked Matthew Fox, who talks about God as being, isness, he said, is the better translation, that isness of God. I asked, is that conscious, or what is the relationship of that being and consciousness? And Matthew Fox was a little interested in my question, I guess we could say, and he first replied that Thomas Aquinas, the greatest of all Christian theologians, had called God's fundamental characteristic joy. And he said, so joy must mean that he's conscious. So then I asked, well, what's the relationship of that conscious being to the individual? Is God an individual? And he replied that, well, in the West we talk about God as an individual, but in the East they have an impersonal idea of God. And he really wasn't able to answer the question, is God an individual? He didn't really answer that in any way. So I'm looking forward to meeting him again on December 21st, just a couple of weeks from now, and we will have that discussion further. And I am going to bring up, again, extraterrestrial information about God, and also some Sufis, especially Allama Iqbal's ideas about God, and see how that... All right, so that was a quick summary of this course, and I'm going to go now and see what questions we may have. Here's a very good question. Umar Jamil Ahmed. Could you kindly discuss in detail the history and the credibility of the books you referred to and their reliability as far as their authorship is concerned? Yes, that's a very, very good question. Important question. So the books that I used are, well, a series of books by Zecharia Sitchin first, which talk about the ancient Sumerian texts. And Zecharia Sitchin was a great scholar of ancient West Asian languages, including Sumerian especially, Akkadian, Hebrew, and so he compared the different texts in these different languages, and he pointed out that the Sumerian is the oldest, and therefore we should get information from it. Some people don't think Zecharia Sitchin's translations are accurate because he accepted the Sumerian texts as historical documents rather than as mythology, which most Western scholars had assumed they were, because they talk about flying ships and travel to other planets, and these things were totally unheard of a couple hundred years ago, 150 years ago, when these ancient texts were first being translated. Or, of course, other ancient texts talk about the same sort of thing, so that just seemed like mythology. But now, when we are ourselves traveling into space, it doesn't seem so fantastic. So Zecharia Sitchin said we should take these things as historical documents. So he did that. And as I also mentioned in our discussion, that there could be different timelines. In other words, the ideas, the history as presented in those Sumerian texts is their own ideas. The Sumerians, or the Anunnaki, who were the extraterrestrials that the Sumerians based their ideas on or got their ideas from, they had their own ideas, or they wanted to promote their own ideas. So we can't rely on any of these sources as 100% perfect, but certainly we can learn something from them, and we can use them to gain a better understanding, being critical, of course, of each of these sources. So that was the first source, Zecharia Sitchin's books based on ancient Sumerian texts. The second source was the Law of One series. The Law of One books were channeled. And are they reliable? Well, I think, and many people who have studied them think they're one of the best sources of extraterrestrial information. And so their authorship is said to be a group of sixth density beings who originally came from Venus and now live in a social group who are all integrated into one, because they all are telepathic. So that is said to be the source of that information. And I have studied it quite a bit, and I find it, for the most part, very reliable, at least certainly very helpful, and giving us a lot of important ideas to study and investigate and learn from. Again, taking everything with a critical eye and not accepting anything blindly. And the third book, which I used more than any others, was the Urantia book. The Urantia book, again, was sort of, well, not exactly channeled, but in one sense it was, because it was written by a man when he was sleeping and was unaware of what was going on. And these written texts would appear when he woke up in the morning, and he actually didn't know what was going on, and he had a doctor, a psychiatrist, who was studying, and then when they found these texts, he and some friends of his began being astonished by how profound this information seemed to be. So then they developed a whole group, and they could ask questions, and they would get answers through this same method. So is that credible? Well, you have to study it and decide for yourself. I've studied it for the past 20-some years, and I find it, although I don't think it's completely accurate, but I think there are a lot of very good ideas that we can gain from it. So that's a pretty long answer to your question, Omar Sahib, but that's an important question. Thank you very much. Okay, Miriam Bande asks, Allah created everything including consciousness, so He has to be the source of consciousness, the isness, right? Yes, definitely. Allah is definitely the source of everything, including consciousness. The issue that Matthew Fox and I were discussing is whether God is conscious or is somehow the ground of consciousness, whether God is a being or is somehow the ground of being or is being itself. And this idea is becoming widespread actually in 20th century and 21st century Christian mysticism and theology, that God is not a being, but God is being itself. God is consciousness itself, not a conscious being. So I was challenging that idea, and Matthew Fox was a little surprised even at the questions I was asking. But to me it's crystal clear, both from extraterrestrial sources and from Muslim Sufi mystics, that yes, God definitely is a conscious individual. But that idea is a little stunning even to modern Western Christian mystics who are steeped in this tradition of God as being or God as isness. But certainly Allah is the source of isness, is the source of consciousness, the source of being. Abu Bakr Rana, when we have not solved the issues on earth, is it wise to go into extraterrestrial issues? Well, maybe extraterrestrial issues can help us solve some of our issues on earth. Why not, if they have information that can help us? And we have a very limited understanding of our history. So, besides, we are going out into space now, so I think definitely we can help solve our issues on earth when we gain insights and information from extraterrestrial sources. Turub Khan, He is you, He is me, He is everyone, the good and bad. Our souls are not in the right form, so we can't see that. Okay, mystics have often used language like that. That God is in everything. Matthew Fox is sort of, he calls it panentheism. There are two types of monism, you might say, that everything is God, or God is everything, and the other idea, which God is in everything, and everything is in God. That second idea is what Matthew Fox holds, and is called panentheism. So you have to be careful, because pantheism or monism, when you say God is you, God is me, God is everyone, God is everything, is there no difference then between us and God? So that I would call an incorrect understanding. We are God, but we're not Allah. We're a tiny part of God. We're not really God Himself, but we are an energy of God. So God Himself, Allah Himself, is infinite and is the source of everything else. We are not infinite and the source of everything else. We're much greater than we usually act, the way we act and think we are, but we're not Allah. That's my understanding anyway, so you may or may not agree with that. Some mystics think, as you seem to be saying, that right now we can't realize this, but actually we are God. We are Allah. I don't accept that idea. This is Wahdat al-Wujud and Wahdat al-Shuhud. This has been discussed at great length by Sufis. All right, Miriam Bande, can't Allah be both a consciousness and the consciousness? Yes. I like that wording very much, yes. I mean, I don't think anyone would doubt, who has gone into this from a, I don't know what I should use, what perspective, whether it's a Muslim or Christian perspective, we cannot doubt that God is the consciousness and is a consciousness. But some people do have this discussion, that God is the consciousness but not a consciousness. That's exactly what I was discussing with Matthew Fox. And I think we, that means those of us who are familiar with Islamic mysticism, can answer the question very easily as you're doing, that yes, God is both the consciousness and a consciousness. But some modern Christian mystics shy away from that idea, and some medieval Christian mystics shy away from that idea that God is a consciousness. They want to think of God as the consciousness or the ground of all consciousness, and rather than being a conscious being or a conscious individual. All right, Umar Jamil Ahmed Sahib again. Allama Iqbal has a very good discussion in the first few chapters of his Reconstruction. I highly recommend it. Maybe you could go on a series of lectures on it. All right, maybe I will. Yes, I read the Reconstruction of Religious Thought in Islam many, many years ago. That was Allama Iqbal's doctoral dissertation. So maybe I will go and read that again and give some classes on it. Thank you for that suggestion. I will take it very seriously. Okay, Umar Jamil Ahmed again. Good discussion on the consciousness and being. Thank you very much. Okay, Turab Khan now says, thank you, I actually agree. So Turab Khan was the one who was saying, he is you, he is me, he is everyone. So when I clarified, that doesn't mean that we are God, he agreed. All right, so, well, I'm sorry that I haven't had time yet to go back and look at all of your questions that have been typed after I finished the class, because I've been very, very busy, and I will be very busy for the next several months even. I'm writing a book called God's Face Among Us. I've talked about this before, and I've posted some of it. But I'm working on it very, very actively. I was almost the whole day today. I've been working on it, and the last few days. And some days last week I spent one day like 18 hours getting up early in the morning and just working on even forgetting to eat, because I have a publisher now and some deadlines I want to make and reach. So I'm working very, very busily on that. So it may be some time before I have a class like this again. It's not scheduled until January anyway, so we won't have any more classes this month. But I may continue some chats. I am going to have the Urdu chat that I've been having regularly every Saturday morning here in USA, Saturday evening in Pakistan. So I will do that. I haven't had it every week the last couple of weeks, but for most of this last several months I've been doing that. I will continue doing that. All right, thank you all very, very much, and peace be with you. And we look forward to more classes on extraterrestrial history and cosmology and concepts and spirituality in the future.